Mara Dalton was 22 years old the night she stumbled upon the man everyone believed had died. She found him rejected, abandoned, and left to die with his newborn twins beside him. Before the story of that night unfolds, remember to like this video, subscribe, and comment the country you're watching from. The restricted woodland had always been off limits, a place whispered about in hushed tones by the elders of Mara's village. Ancient trees twisted their gnarled branches toward the sky, forming a canopy so dense that even moonlight struggled to penetrate the darkness below. The forest floor was carpeted with moss that seemed to swallow sound, creating an eerie silence that made even the bravest souls turn back. But on this particular night, Mara found herself crossing the boundary she had been warned against her entire life. She shouldn't have been there. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to retreat to the safety of her small cottage on the village's edge. But something pulled her forward, an invisible thread tugging at her consciousness. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, sounds that didn't belong to any creature she recognized. There was a low, guttural breathing punctuated by sharp intakes of pain. And beneath it all, the faint, desperate cries of infants piercing the night air. The metallic scent hit her next. Sharp and overwhelming, blood, fresh blood, and lots of it. The smell seemed to coat her throat as she breathed, making her stomach turn. But still, she pressed forward, her grandmother's old stories echoing in her mind. Tales of creatures that walked between worlds, of ancient pacts and broken promises, of guardians and betrayals. Myra had never believed them, dismissing them as folklore meant to frighten children. Yet here she was, deep in Forbidden's territory, chasing sounds that logic told her to flee from. Her boots crunched softly on fallen twigs as she navigated through the underbrush, her heart hammering against her ribs. The crying grew louder, more urgent, joined now by a rasping breath that sounded like it was being drawn through shattered glass. Myra's fingers instinctively went to the charm hanging around her neck, the one her grandmother had pressed into her palm with trembling hands just before she died. The metal felt warm against her skin, almost pulsing with a life of its own. Mara Dalton had been raised by her grandmother, a woman whose weathered hands could draw poison from wounds, and whose whispered words could ease even the most agonizing pain. The old woman practiced ancient healing arts, methods passed down through generations of women who had served as midwives, healers, and something more. Something her grandmother had never fully explained. Even in those final days when her breath came shallow and her eyes grew distant. On her deathbed, the old woman had clutched Myra's hand with surprising strength. She'd pressed a small object into her granddaughter's palm, a pendant carved from bone and metal, intricate symbols etched into its surface. The craftsmanship was unlike anything Mira had ever seen. The metal neither silver nor gold, but something in between, something that seemed to shift in the light. Attached to it was a delicate chain that felt impossibly strong, links so fine they looked like they'd been woven rather than forged. "This is yours now," her grandmother had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Our family has carried this for longer than memory. We are protectors, Mara. We guard the boundary between their world and ours. We heal what others would destroy. Never forget what you are." Myra had wanted to ask so many questions. Who needed protecting? What boundary? What did any of it mean? But her grandmother's eyes had already begun to glaze, her breathing slowing to nothing. In the years since, Myra had worn the pendant every day, feeling its weight against her chest like a constant reminder of mysteries she didn't understand. She'd assumed it was just family mythology, stories to give meaning to a lineage of rural healers who tended to farmers and their livestock. But her grandmother had spoken of the border forest with particular reverence and fear. She'd made Myra promise never to enter those woods, never to cross into the territory where the trees grew so thick that they blocked out the sun. "That's where they live," she'd said. "The old ones, the ones who remember the pacts. Stay away, child. Our time of guardianship has passed." Yet here Mira stood, deep in those very woods, her grandmother's warning echoing in her ears even as she pushed forward. The pendant against her chest grew warmer with each step, as if recognizing something in the air around her. She'd ignored the warnings. She'd crossed the boundary. And now, whatever waited in the darkness ahead would either validate her grandmother's stories or prove them to be nothing more than the ramblings of an old, Woman lost in tradition. Mara emerged into a small clearing, and the sight before her stole the breath from her lungs. A man lay sprawled across the forest floor, his body illuminated by slivers of moonlight that managed to pierce the canopy above. He was massive, even in his collapsed state, his frame speaking of raw power and dominance. But it was the wounds covering his body that made Myra's stomach lurch. They weren't random. They weren't the result of an animal attack or an accident. These wounds had been inflicted with purpose, with ceremony. Long, deliberate cuts crossed his chest and arms, symbols carved into his flesh with precision. Some were shallow, meant to cause pain without killing quickly. Others were deeper, designed to bleed him slowly. The blood had soaked into the earth beneath him, creating a dark stain that spread out like a shadow. But it was what lay beside him that broke through Myra's shock and forced her into action. Two tiny bundles, wrapped in what looked like torn cloth, lay near the man's outstretched arm. The crying she'd heard came from them newborn babies. Their faces scrunched and red, their small bodies trembling in the cold night air. They couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Still bearing the traces of birth on their fragile skin, the man had positioned himself, even in his dying state, so that his body shielded the infants from the wind. One massive hand lay protectively over them. Fingers curled as if even unconscious, he was trying to keep them safe. The juxtaposition was striking, this powerful, wounded creature and these helpless, innocent lives depending on him for protection he could barely provide. Myra's mind raced. This was the moment. She could turn around. She could pretend she never saw this, never crossed into these woods. She could go home, bar her door, and let whatever dark drama was unfolding here resolve itself without her involvement. Every rational thought screamed at her to flee, to protect herself. To remember that she was just a village healer with no business in whatever violence had transpired here. But the babies cried, their voices weak and desperate. And in that moment, Mira Dalton made a choice that would alter the course of her life forever. She stepped forward into the clearing, her hands already reaching for the medical supplies she always carried. Her grandmother's training taking over even as fear coursed through her veins. The moment Myra's foot crossed into the clearing, the man's eyes snapped open. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that she stumbled backward with a gasp. His eyes weren't human. They glowed with an amber light that seemed to burn from within, pupils elongated like those of a wolf. The intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable, as was the feral warning they carried. A growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound that vibrated through the ground and into Myra's bones. It was a predator's warning, primal and unmistakable. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth that were just slightly too sharp, too pointed to belong to any normal man. Even dying, even barely conscious, he radiated danger and power. "Stay back," he rasped, his voice rough and broken. Each word seemed to cost him, his chest heaving with the effort. "Don't come closer." But Mara noticed something crucial. Even as he warned her away, even as his body tensed with aggression, he was careful not to disturb the babies beside him. His protective hand never moved from where it sheltered them. He would threaten her, perhaps even attack her if she came too close, but he wouldn't risk harming the infants. Not even to save himself. She could smell him now, a scent that confirmed what his eyes had already told her. He wasn't human. Beneath the blood and earth, there was something wild, something that spoke of forests and moonlight and ancient instincts. It was a scent that should have terrified her, that should have sent her running back to the safety of her village. But instead, it triggered something in her memory, something her grandmother had described in those old stories. Use single quotes re. Myra started, then stopped, unsure how to finish. What was he? The legends spoke of many things, but she'd never truly believed any of them were real. His glowing eyes, fixed on her with intensity that made her feel pinned in place. "Why would you help me?" he demanded, his voice carrying centuries of bitterness. "Your kind hates mine. You hunt us. You betray us. You—" He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Leave, let me die in peace. And them?" Myra asked, gesturing to the babies. "What about them?" His expression crumbled for just a moment, pain flickering across his features that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. "They're innocent," he whispered. "They deserve better than this." Myra stood at the edge of the clearing, every fiber of her being warring with itself. "Run," logic screamed. "This is not your concern." Whatever happened here, whatever violence and betrayal led to this moment, it has nothing to do with you. Go home. Lock your door. Forget you ever saw this. But the babies cried, their voices growing weaker. She was a healer. Her grandmother had trained her to preserve life, to fight against death with every tool and technique their family had accumulated over generations. How could she walk away from two innocent lives, two helpless infants who had done nothing to deserve being born into this nightmare? "I won't let your children die," Myra said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. She took a step forward, then another, her hands raised to show she carried no weapons. The man's eyes widened, shock replacing the hostility there. "You would risk yourself? For creatures you've been taught to fear?" "They're not creatures," Myra replied, moving closer. "They're babies. And whatever you are, whatever brought you to this place, they're innocent." She knelt beside the infants, her hands gently touching their small bodies. They were so cold, their skin taking on a bluish tint that spoke of dangerous exposure. She needed to get them warm, needed to feed them, needed to protect them from the elements. But she also needed to keep this man alive, because despite everything, he was their father. They would need him. The man watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. His glowing eyes tracked her every movement as she carefully examined the twins. Her trained hands gentle as she checked for injuries or deformities. Finding none, she carefully gathered them in her arms, using her own body heat to begin warming them. "What's your name?" the man asked suddenly, his voice carrying a strange urgency. "Myra," she replied. "Myra Dalton." The reaction was immediate. His entire body went rigid, his eyes widening further. "Dalton," he repeated, the name seeming to carry weight on his tongue. "You're a Dalton woman, you know my family?" Myra asked, surprised. "I know the legends," he said, studying her with new intensity. Something in her lineage had triggered recognition in him, had transformed her from potential threat to something else entirely. "I know what your bloodline represents, perhaps. Perhaps this is not chance after all." He relaxed slightly, his hand finally moving away from the protective position over where the babies had been. "Help me," he said, the words clearly difficult for his pride. "Help us. I'll explain everything, but please. Save my daughters." Getting him to her cabin was an ordeal Myra would never forget. Despite his injuries, despite the blood loss that should have rendered him unconscious if not dead, he was impossibly heavy. It was as if his bones were made of stone, his muscles dense beyond anything human. She struggled under his weight, her shoulders burning with effort as she half carried him through the forest. He tried to help, his legs occasionally finding purchase and propelling them forward a few more feet. But mostly he was dead weight, his consciousness flickering in and out like a candle in the wind. Through it all, Myra kept the twins wrapped carefully in her cloak, pressed against her chest where her body heat could keep them alive. Their crying had quieted to occasional whimpers, which worried her more than the screaming had. The journey that should have taken 30 minutes stretched to nearly 2 hours. By the time Myra's small cabin came into view, her arms were shaking with exhaustion and her back screamed in protest. But she pushed forward, driven by determination and the knowledge that stopping meant death for all three of her. Unexpected charges. Her cabin was modest. A single large room with a fireplace, a bed, a table, and shelves lined with herbs and medical supplies. It had been her grandmother's home, and before that, her great-grandmother's. Generations of Dalton women had lived here, on the border between the village and the forest, serving as healers and, if the stories were true, something more. Myra managed to drag the man to her bed, heaving his massive frame onto the mattress with the last of her strength. He groaned as she moved him, fresh blood seeping from his wounds. But there was no time to tend to him yet. The babies came first. She placed them near the fire on a blanket she'd spread on the floor. The warmth from the flames immediately began to work its magic, bringing color back to their tiny faces. She heated goat's milk from her stores, testing it carefully on her wrist before using a clean cloth to let them suckle drops of the warm liquid. It was slow, painstaking work, but gradually they began to drink. As she worked, Myra studied them. They were beautiful despite everything. Identical twins, both girls, with delicate features and downy black hair. But there was something otherworldly about them, too. Something in the faint glow of their eyes when they opened them. Something in the strength of their tiny grips when their fingers wrapped around hers. Once the babies were fed and sleeping, peacefully in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from a drawer, Myra turned her attention to the man. Up close, in the light of her fire, she could see him more clearly. He was handsome in a brutal, primal way, with sharp features and dark hair streaked with silver. But it was the wounds that demanded her attention. Now that she could examine them properly, Myra's blood ran cold. These weren't just deliberate, they were ritualistic. The symbols carved into his flesh were ancient, recognizable from the oldest of her grandmother's texts. Rejection marks. Banishment cuts. Each one designed not just to harm, but to sever, to cast out, to unmake whatever bond had once existed. Worse, she could smell the silver in his blood. Someone had coated their blades with silver before cutting him, and the metal had mixed with his blood, creating a poison that was slowly killing him from within. Silver wounds on his kind didn't heal naturally. They festered, they spread, and they killed slowly and agonizingly. She would need every technique her grandmother had taught her, every secret remedy passed down through her family line. This wouldn't just be healing. This would be a battle against death itself. Mira worked through the night, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she fought to save the stranger's life. She started by cleaning the wounds, using water mixed with salt and herbs that made the man groan in his semi-conscious state. The silver had to be drawn out, but doing so would cause excruciating pain. She mixed a poultice from ingredients she'd harvested herself, wolfsbane. Ironically, along with yarrow, comfrey, and a dozen other plants whose properties had been documented in her family's journals. The paste had a strange shimmer to it, reacting to the silver poisoning in ways that confirmed these recipes had been designed specifically for treating his kind. As she applied the poultice to the deepest wounds, the man's eyes snapped open, fully aware now. His jaw clenched tight, tendons standing out in his neck as he fought against the pain. But he didn't cry out. He didn't scream. He simply bore it with a stoicism that spoke of a lifetime of enduring suffering in silence. It will get worse before it gets better, Mira warned him softly, preparing the next application. I know, he ground out through gritted teeth. I've been silver poisoned before. But never like this. Who did this to you? Myra asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. My pack, he said, the words heavy with betrayal. My family, my people. Between applications of the poultice, he told her his story. How his mate had died, bringing the twins into the world. How the pack elders had declared the babies abominations, half-bloods who carried Forbidden's heritage in their veins. How his own uncle had led the charge to have them destroyed. How he'd fought to protect his daughters and been overwhelmed, dragged to the forest, and subjected to the ritual of complete rejection. They carved away my titles, he explained, gesturing to the symbols on his chest. Each mark represents something taken. My position. My authority. My place in the pack. They wanted to erase me completely, to make it as though I'd never existed. And the twins? Myra asked, checking on the sleeping infants. They were supposed to die with me. Abandoned in the forest, killed by exposure if the predators didn't get them first. His voice broke slightly. I tried to keep them warm. I tried to shield them. But I was dying, and I knew I'd failed them. You didn't fail, Mira said firmly, meeting his glowing eyes. You kept them alive long enough for me to find you. And I won't let them die. I promise you that. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Why? He asked. Why risk everything for us? Because no one deserves to die rejected and alone, Myra replied. And because your daughters deserve a chance at life? They didn't choose any of this. Throughout the night, she continued her work, carefully drawing the silver from his system. It was a delicate process, requiring multiple applications of the poultice and frequent monitoring. Too much too fast could send him into shock. Too little too slow and the poison would continue spreading, eventually reaching his heart and killing him. But gradually, miraculously, he began to improve. The feverish heat in his skin cooled. The deathly pallor faded, replaced by healthier color. The wounds, while still severe, stopped weeping silver-tainted blood. He would survive. Against all odds, he would live. As dawn light began to creep through the cabin's window, Mira finally allowed herself to sit, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. The man watched her from the bed, his expression unreadable. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "A Dalton woman saved the Alpha King." The title hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Alpha King. Mira had heard the term in her grandmother's stories, but she'd never truly understood what it meant. Now, looking at the man in her bed, seeing the way his presence seemed to fill the small cabin despite his weakened state, she began to comprehend. "The mark of Fenris," the man said, placing his hand over his chest where, beneath the bandages, Mira had noticed a symbol that seemed to glow faintly. "Has your family history mentioned it?" Myra searched her memory, recalling passages from her grandmother's journals. "The crest of the first Alpha," she said slowly. "Given to the one who leads all packs, who maintains the ancient laws, who protects our kind from extinction," he finished. I was Kieran Blackthorne, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. Until my own people decided I was expendable. The name sent a shiver through Myra. Even in her isolated village, stories of Kieran Blackthorne had reached them. The youngest Alpha King in centuries, a warrior who'd united fractious packs and defended their territories from human incursion. A leader said to be both brutal and just, capable of terrible violence but bound by unbreakable codes of honor. "But everyone thinks you're dead," Mira said, remembering the rumors that had swept through the region months ago. "There were reports of your death in battle." "Convenient, isn't it?" Kieran's voice dripped with bitterness. "My uncle, Aldrich, orchestrated it perfectly. My mate dies in childbirth, giving birth to twins who carry her complicated heritage. The pack elders, already uneasy with my youth and the changes I'd implemented, saw an opportunity. They declared the children cursed, demanded their death. When I refused, they had all the justification they needed. So they staged your death," Myra said, piecing it together. "Made it look like you died honorably while actually performing the ritual of erasure," Kieran confirmed. "They wanted me gone in every way, physically dead, legally unmade, historically erased. And the twins along with me." He shifted slightly, grimacing at the pain but pushing through it. "What makes the betrayal particularly bitter is that Aldrich was my mentor. He taught me how to lead, how to fight, how to navigate pack politics. I trusted him absolutely. And he used that trust to destroy me." "What was your mate's heritage?" Myra asked, glancing at the sleeping twins. "What makes them Forbidden's blood?" Kieran's expression softened when he looked at his daughters. Their mother was descended from the Moon-Blessed, an ancient bloodline that predates the pack system. Her kind were shamans, healers, bridges between the Wolf and the spirit. But they were also powerful, and power threatens those who crave control. The elders banned unions with Moon-Blessed lines centuries ago, declaring them heretical. "But you loved her anyway," Myra said softly. "I did. Alara was extraordinary. She saw the future in dreams, could heal with a touch, understood the old ways that most have forgotten. We knew our union would be controversial, but I was Alpha King. I thought my position would protect us. Protect our children." His voice cracked. "I was wrong." Mara sat with this information, trying to process the magnitude of what she'd stumbled into. This wasn't just a rejected Wolf and his offspring. This was political upheaval, ancient prejudices, and power struggles that spanned generations. "The twins," Kieran continued, "carry both the Alpha bloodline and the Moon-Blessed heritage. That combination hasn't existed in centuries. Some believe it makes them abominations. Others fear they might be too powerful to control. Either way, their very existence challenges the established order. And you're sure Aldrich staged this?" Myra asked. "Certain. He'd been positioning himself for years, building alliances with the more conservative elders, whispering doubts about my leadership. Alara's death gave him the opening he needed. And now, with me officially dead and the twins supposedly killed by exposure, he's free to claim the title of Alpha King for himself." The babies stirred in their makeshift cradle, one of them letting out a small cry. Mira went to them immediately, checking to ensure they were warm and comfortable. As she gazed down at their small faces, she felt the weight of what preserving their lives meant. She wasn't just sheltering refugees. She was protecting the last legitimate heirs to a throne, children whose existence could spark a war. "What will you do?" she asked Kieran. "When you're healed, I mean." His eyes glowed brighter, amber fire burning with renewed purpose. "I will reclaim what's mine. I will expose Aldrich's betrayal. I will protect my daughters and ensure they can live without fear." He paused, then added more softly, "But first, I need to survive. And I need to understand why a Dalton woman risked everything to save me." As Kieran continued to heal over the following days, Mira found herself learning more about her family's history than she'd ever known. Kieran recognized not just her surname but what it represented. And he was eager, perhaps too eager, to share that knowledge. "The Dalton line," he explained one evening as Mira changed his bandages, "is ancient. Your ancestors were there at the first Concord, when humans and wolves established the boundaries that separated our worlds." Myra's hands stilled. "The first Concord is real? I thought it was just a legend." "Very real," Kieran confirmed. "And your family played a crucial role. The Dalton women, it's always been the women, interestingly served as mediators. They possess something unique, an ability to exist in both worlds without fully belonging to either. They could heal our kind when others couldn't. Could walk our lands without triggering our territorial instincts. Could forge bonds of trust that transcended species." He gestured to the pendant around her neck, the one her grandmother had given her. "That charm you wear, may I see it?" Hesitantly, Mira lifted the pendant, allowing him to examine it without removing it from her neck. His reaction was immediate, his eyes widening with recognition. "Moon-forged metal," he breathed. "I haven't seen this alloy in decades. I haven't seen this alloy in decades. It's made from silver and Volf iron, two metals that should be incompatible, but that bond under moonlight when treated with specific rituals. It's incredibly rare, incredibly valuable." "What does it do?" Myra asked. "It marks you as a guardian," Kieran said. "A true guardian, not just in title, but in function. That pendant gives you safe passage in any Volf territory, grants you the authority to demand truth from our kind, and protects you from attack by all but the most feral or desperate." Myra stared at the small charm with new eyes. Her grandmother had called it a family heirloom, but this was so much more. "Why didn't my grandmother tell me?" "Perhaps she believed the old ways were dying," Kieran suggested. "For the last century, the bonds between your kind and mine have weakened. The Concord has been largely forgotten. Your family's role as guardians seemed obsolete. But now," he met her eyes significantly, "now a Dalton woman has saved an Alpha King and his heirs. Perhaps the old patterns are reasserting themselves." Over the next several days, as Kieran grew stronger and the twins began to thrive under Myra's care, she learned more about her heritage. Her family hadn't just been healers, they'd been peacekeepers, diplomats, and occasionally warriors. They'd maintained the balance between human settlements and Volf territories, preventing conflicts before they could escalate into war. "Your grandmother must have been remarkable," Kieran said one afternoon, watching Myra tend to his daughters with practiced ease. To have passed on so much knowledge, even if she didn't explain its full significance. "She was," Myra agreed, feeling a pang of loss. "She died when I was 19, but she spent my entire childhood teaching me. Herbs, medicines, rituals, stories. I thought she was just passing on folk remedies and fairy tales. I never realized it was actual history, actual technique." "She was preparing you," Kieran said. "Perhaps she knew somehow that you would be needed." The thought unsettled Myra. Had her grandmother foreseen this? Had she known that one day Mira would find herself protecting the Alpha King and his children? Or was this all simply chance, a random convergence of circumstances that happened to align with ancient patterns? One evening, as Myra held one of the twins, they still needed names. But Kieran seemed reluctant to name them without some kind of ceremony. She asked the question that had been troubling her. "If my family were guardians, why did we stop? What changed?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment. "There was a betrayal," he finally said. "About 150 years ago, according to our records. A Dalton woman fell in love with an Alpha, bore his child. It violated the guardian oath. You were meant to serve all wolves equally, not bind yourself to one pack, one bloodline. The other pack saw it as favoritism, as corruption of the guardian role. There was violence. The woman and her child were killed. And after that, your family withdrew from our world. They abandoned their duty because of one tragedy? Myra asked, surprised. Not abandoned, exiled. The wolves refused to accept a Dalton guardian after that, saw the entire line as compromised. Your family retreated to the borderlands, continuing to practice healing but no longer actively engaging with our kind. Over generations, the truth became myth, the history became legend. Until all that remained were stories and tokens like that pendant. Myra absorbed this, feeling the weight of history settling on her shoulders. She was the latest in a long line of women who had served as bridges between worlds, and that role had been violently severed generations before her birth. Yet here she was, once again standing between human and Wolf, healing and protecting, stepping into a role she hadn't chosen but couldn't deny. Do you think that's why I found you? She asked quietly. Some kind of destiny or fate? Kieran smiled, the expression transforming his face from harsh to almost gentle. I think you found me because you were brave enough to investigate strange sounds in a forbidden forest. I think you saved me because your grandmother raised you to value life above fear. But he paused, his glowing eyes intense. But I also think some patterns run deeper than we understand. Perhaps your bloodline has been waiting all this time to return to its purpose. Perhaps my daughters are the reason, the catalyst that brings the guardians back into the world. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Myra had spent her entire life feeling like an outsider in her own village. Too educated, too strange, too connected to old ways that no one else cared about. But maybe she wasn't an outsider. Maybe she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. On the seventh night, the howling began. Distant at first, barely audible over the wind in the trees, but growing steadily closer. Kieran heard it before Mara did, his entire body going tense, his eyes snapping to the door. They're searching, he said, his voice low and urgent. Aldrich must have sent trackers. Myra felt her heart rate spike. How did they find us? They're following my scent, Kieran explained, already trying to rise from the bed despite his injuries. Even weakened, even dying, an Alpha King leaves a trail. They've probably been searching the forest since that night, and now they've picked up my path. You can't fight them, Myra said, pushing him back down. You're still healing. Those wounds won't matter if they find us, Kieran interrupted. If they reach this cabin, if they discover I'm alive and the twins survived, they'll kill us all. Aldrich can't afford loose ends. Myra's mind raced. Fight was impossible, Kieran was too weak, and she was no warrior. Flight was equally futile with 2 newborns and an injured man. That left only one option. My grandmother's journals, she said suddenly, moving to the old trunk in the corner. She wrote about concealment rituals, ways to hide from your kind. Scent masking, Kieran said with growing hope. Can you do it? I've never tried, Mira admitted, pulling out worn, leather-bound books. But the instructions are detailed. She worked quickly, mixing ingredients according to formulas her grandmother had recorded in precise detail. Ash from specific trees, oils pressed from rare flowers, powders ground from stones found only in certain riverbeds. The components seemed random, but when combined in the proper order, they created a paste that shimmered with faint iridescence. This goes on all of us, Mira explained, beginning to apply the paste to her own skin. It masks our scent, makes us unreadable to Wolf senses. But it only lasts a few hours. She worked quickly, coating Kieran's skin wherever it was exposed, careful around his healing wounds. Then she turned to the twins, gently rubbing the paste on their tiny arms and legs, their faces and hair. They fussed at the strange sensation but didn't cry. As if understanding somehow that silence was necessary, that the howling grew closer. Through the window, Myra could see shapes moving between the trees, massive forms that shouldn't exist. Wolves the size of horses, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Their movements coordinated and purposeful. Trackers, hunters, executioners. Put out the fire, Kieran whispered. Any light will draw them. Myra doused the flames, plunging the cabin into darkness. She gathered the twins, holding them close to her chest, and positioned herself near Kieran's bed. If the wolves broke through, if the concealment failed, at least they would face it together. The pack circled the cabin, so close that Mira could hear their breathing, could hear their claws scratching against stone and wood. One massive wolf approached the door, its nose pressed against the crack, audibly inhaling. Myra held her breath, clutching the babies tighter, feeling Kieran's hand grip her arm in shared tension. Minutes passed like hours. The wolves circled again, clearly confused. They tracked Kieran to this area, but now his scent had vanished. Mira could hear them communicating in low growls and rumbles, a language she didn't understand but whose frustration was clear. Finally, mercifully, the pack moved on. The howls grew distant again, fading into the night as the trackers searched elsewhere. But everyone in that cabin knew this was temporary. The hunters would return. The concealment wouldn't work forever. They needed a more permanent solution. "We have to leave," Kieran said once he was certain the pack had moved out of earshot. "This cabin isn't safe anymore." "Nothing in this territory is safe. Where can we go?" Myra asked. "They're searching everywhere." "South," Kieran said decisively. "To the free territories, lands that don't answer to pack law. It's a week's journey, maybe more with my injuries and the twins. But it's our only chance." Mara looked around her small cabin, the only home she'd ever known. Leaving meant abandoning everything, her grandmother's legacy, the grave she tended, the life she'd built in careful isolation. But staying meant death, not just for her but for the 3 lives she'd chosen to protect. "We'll need supplies," she said, making the decision. "Food, medicine, things for the babies. I can gather what we need, but we'll have to leave before dawn." "They'll track us," Kieran warned. "Then we'll use every trick my grandmother taught me to hide our trail," Mira replied. "We've made it this far. We'll find a way." Before they could leave, Kieran needed to be able to walk, to move without risking his wounds reopening. That meant completing the healing ritual, the final step that Mira had been dreading. The silver had been drawn from his system, but remnants remained, embedded in his flesh like microscopic shards. They had to be removed, and the process would be excruciating. "This will hurt," Mira warned, preparing the tools and poultices. "More than anything you've experienced so far." "I know," Kieran said, his jaw already set with determination. "Do it." The procedure involved reopening the deepest wounds, creating channels through which the remaining silver could be drawn out. Myra had to cut into healing flesh, had to probe with instruments treated with herbs that would attract the silver particles and pull them free. It was primitive, brutal, and absolutely necessary. Kieran bore it in silence. His hands gripped the bed frame so tightly that the wood cracked under the pressure. Sweat poured down his face, and his muscles trembled with the effort of remaining still. But he didn't scream. He didn't beg her to stop. He simply endured, his eyes fixed on his daughters sleeping nearby, drawing strength from their existence. "Why?" Myra asked as she worked, partly to distract him, partly because she genuinely wanted to know. "Why risk your life for me? Your kingdom is lost, your pack has betrayed you. You could have let me stay hidden, could have gone into exile alone. Why bring me into this?" "Because," Kieran said through gritted teeth, "you saved my daughters when you had every reason to abandon them. You saved me when doing so violated every survival instinct you possess. That kind of courage, that kind of compassion, it's rare. It's precious. And I will not let the people who destroyed my life destroy yours as well." "I made the choice to help you," Mira reminded him gently. "And I'm making the choice to protect you," Kieran replied. "Consider it the beginning of a debt I can never fully repay." Hours later, when the last of the silver had been extracted and the wounds carefully closed with sutures and bandages, Kieran finally allowed himself to rest. His skin had lost the grayish tint that marked silver poisoning. His breathing came easier. The fever that had plagued him was gone. "You'll scar," Myra said, washing her hands in a basin. "The marks they carved into you, some will fade, but others will remain." "Good," Kieran said. "Let them remain. Let them remind me of who I can trust and who I cannot. Let them remind me of the price of complacency, of assuming loyalty is permanent." He sat up slowly, testing his strength. The movement that would have been impossible days ago was now merely difficult. He was healing at a rate that amazed Myra, his supernatural constitution finally able to function properly now that the silver was gone. We leave at dawn, he said. Can you be ready? Mira looked around her cabin one last time, memorizing every detail. The hearth where her grandmother had cooked. The shelves of medicines they'd prepared together. The bed where the old woman had died, whispering secrets and warnings. This place held her entire history, but it couldn't hold her future. Not anymore. I'll be ready, she said, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. Kieran asked Mira to help him with something he'd been avoiding. It was time to name his daughters. In Wolf tradition, naming was a ceremony, a public acknowledgement of a child's place in the pack. But there was no pack here, no elders to witness, no ceremony to perform. There was only a rejected alpha, a guardian healer, and 2 tiny lives that deserved identity. I can't do it alone, Kieran admitted, looking at his sleeping daughters. Their mother should be here. She should be the one to choose their names, to welcome them properly into the world. But she's gone, and I need help. Myra sat beside him, studying the twins. In the days she'd cared for them, she'd begun to notice their distinct personalities. One was quieter, more observant, her eyes tracking movement with unusual focus for a newborn. The other was more vocal, more demanding, her cries stronger and more insistent. Tell me about their mother, Mira said softly. What would she have wanted for them? Kieran's expression softened with memory and grief. Alara believed in the old ways, the traditions that predate pack politics and territorial disputes. She used to say that names should reflect not who a child is, but who they have the potential to become. A name is a blessing and a prophecy. He reached out, gently touching the quieter twin's small hand. This one, she has her mother's eyes. Even now I can see it. She'd be a seer, I think. A dreamer who walks between worlds. Then she needs a name that honors that, Mira said. She thought of the old stories her grandmother had told, of moon goddesses and prophets. What about Selene? It means moon, and in the old tales, the moon sees all, knows all, guards the night. Selene, Kieran repeated, testing the name. A smile crossed his face, the first genuine smile Mira had seen from him. Yes, Selene Blackthorn, daughter of the moon blessed, heir to visions and dreams. It's perfect. He turned to the other twin, the more vocal one. And this fierce little warrior. She need a name to match her spirit. Mara watched the second twin, noting the strength in her movements, the determination even in her infant gestures. Fire, she said suddenly. She reminds me of fire. Bright, fierce, impossible to contain. Ember, Kieran said. Not the conflagration, but the burning coal that refuses to die, that can reignite into flames when all seems lost. Ember Blackthorn, daughter of the moon blessed, heir to strength and resilience. The naming felt sacred, despite the lack of ceremony. As Kieran spoke each name, as he formally acknowledged his daughter's existence and place in the world, Myra felt something shift in the air around them. The twins seemed to respond, both stirring and opening their eyes as if recognizing that they were no longer nameless, no longer undefined. They were Selene and Ember, and they were loved. Thank you, Kieran said to Myra, his voice thick with emotion, for helping me do this. For making sure they weren't just casualties of politics and betrayal. They're beautiful, Myra replied. Both of them. Both of them. And they're going to grow up strong and safe. I promise you that. It was a promise that would shape everything that followed. A commitment made in the quiet of dawn that bound Mira to these children and their father in ways she was only beginning to understand. They left as the sun crested the horizon. Myra carrying a pack filled with supplies, and Kieran cradling his daughters against his chest in a sling she'd fashioned. He was still weak, still healing, but determination drove him forward. Every step away from the cabin was a step toward safety, toward survival, toward a future that seemed impossible but that they would fight for anyway. Mira had applied the concealment paste again, masking their scents and buying them time. She'd also used techniques her grandmother had taught her to confuse their trail walking in streams, doubling back, using aromatic plants to create false paths. It wouldn't fool the trackers forever, but it might give them the head start they needed. The forest was different in daylight, less ominous but no less dangerous. Kieran moved with surprising stealth for someone so large and injured, his instincts guiding him to avoid areas where other wolves might patrol. Myra followed his lead, trusting his knowledge of the territory even as she remained alert for threats he might miss. They walked in silence for hours, speaking only when necessary, conserving energy for the long journey ahead. The twins slept against Kieran's chest, occasionally waking to fuss before being soothed back to sleep. Mira found herself constantly checking on them, ensuring they were warm enough, secure enough, breathing properly. By midday, they'd covered significant distance, putting miles between themselves and the cabin. But Kieran was flagging, his body not yet fully recovered from the trauma he'd endured. Myra called for a rest, finding a sheltered hollow where they could pause without being easily spotted. As Kieran fed the twins drops of milk and Myra checked his bandages for signs of bleeding or infection, they finally allowed themselves to talk. "Tell me about the free territories," Myra said. "What will we find there?" "Sanctuary, if we're lucky," Kieran replied. "The free territories are lands where pack law doesn't reach, where wolves who've been exiled or rejected can live without persecution. It's not paradise. There's no real governance, no protection beyond what you can provide for yourself. But it's also a place where questions aren't asked, where Aldrich's reach doesn't extend. And after we reach safety?" Myra asked. "What then?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on his daughters. "I rebuild," he said finally. "I gather allies. I expose Aldrich's betrayal. I reclaim my throne, not for myself, but for Celine and Ember. They deserve to grow up knowing who they are, knowing their heritage, having the choice to claim their birthright or walk away from it." "That sounds like a war," Myra observed. "It will be," Kieran agreed. "And I have no right to ask you to be part of it. You've already risked so much, sacrificed your home, your safety. Once we reach the free territories, you can disappear. I'll make sure you have resources, protection, whatever you need to start a new life far from this conflict." Myra considered this. Part of her wanted to accept, to imagine a quiet life somewhere far from pack politics and ancient betrayals. But another part, a part that sounded suspiciously like her grandmother's voice, whispered that walking away now would be abandoning her purpose. "Let's survive the journey first," she said. "Then we can talk about what comes after." They rested for an hour before continuing, pushing deeper into unfamiliar territory. The landscape changed as they traveled, the familiar forests of Myra's home giving way to wilder growths. Trees here were massive ancient things that had stood for centuries. The air felt different too, charged with something primal that made the hair on Myra's arms stand up. As evening approached, they made camp in a small cave Kieran had found. Myra started a tiny fire, just enough to warm milk for the twins and provide minimal light. Kieran sat at the cave's entrance, his eyes scanning the darkness, alert for any sign of pursuit. "Do you think they're still following?" Myra asked quietly. "I know they are," Kieran replied. "Aldrich won't give up. He can't afford to. As long as I live, as long as my daughters live, his claim to power is illegitimate. He'll hunt us to the ends of the earth if necessary." The thought should have terrified Myra. Instead, it filled her with a strange calm. She'd made her choice that night in the forest. She'd committed herself to protecting these lives. Whatever came next, whatever dangers they faced, she wouldn't face them alone. Later that night, after the twins had been fed and settled, after the fire had burned down to embers, Myra and Kieran sat together in companionable silence. The adrenaline of the day had faded, replaced by exhaustion and something else, something neither of them wanted to name, but both felt growing between them. "Tell me about your mother," Kieran said suddenly. "You mentioned she disappeared." Myra was surprised by the question, surprised he'd remembered that detail from their earlier conversations. "She left when I was 6, she said. Just walked into the forest one day and never came back. Search parties found no trace of her, no sign of struggle or accident. She simply vanished." "Your grandmother raised you after that," Kieran said. "Yes, she never spoke much about my mother, always changed the subject when I asked. I used to think she was angry about the abandonment, but now—" Myra trailed off, thinking about everything she'd learned. "Now I wonder if my mother discovered the truth. About our family, about the guardians, about what we were meant to be. Maybe it was too much for her. Or maybe she tried to reclaim that role and paid the price," Kieran suggested gently. "Your grandmother said the wolves killed the last guardian who tried to serve them." Maybe your mother attempted the same thing, and... He didn't finish, but Mira understood. It was a possibility she'd never considered, but it made a horrible kind of sense. Her mother learning about their heritage, deciding to step into that role and being killed for it. Her grandmother, devastated by history repeating itself, choosing to hide the truth from Mira to protect her. I'll never know for sure, Mira said softly. No, Kieran agreed. But you can choose your own path. You're not bound by your mother's choices or your grandmother's fears. You get to decide who you are, who you want to be. And who are you? Myra asked, turning the conversation. Beyond the Alpha King, beyond the betrayed ruler. Who is Kieran Blackthorn? He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his harsh features. I'm not sure I know anymore. I was raised to be Alpha King from the moment I was born. My father died when I was young, and I inherited the title at 16. Everything I've done, every choice I've made has been in service of that role. I've never had the luxury of being just myself. Tell me one thing, Mira pressed. One thing that's just you, not the Alpha King. Kieran thought for a moment. I like to carve, he said finally. Wood carving. Small figures, animals, abstract shapes. It's meditative, peaceful. A rare moment where I don't have to think about politics or battles or responsibilities. Just the wood, the knife, and the shape trying to emerge. Myra smiled, charmed by the image of this powerful, dangerous man creating delicate art. Do you have anything you've made? I had a collection, Kieran said, his expression darkening. In my quarters. Aldrich probably destroyed it all, along with everything else that proved I existed. Then you'll have to start again, Myra said. When this is over, when you've reclaimed your throne, you'll carve new pieces. Better ones. Will you be there to see them? Kieran asked, the question loaded with implications. Mira met his eyes, seeing vulnerability there that the Alpha King would never show. This was just Kieran, asking a question that had nothing to do with politics or destiny. I think, she said carefully, that wherever I end up, it will be somewhere that includes Celine and Ember. I'd become too attached to them to walk.